thing tonight, we're going to be talking about the idea how God actually applies the Ten Commandment law in real life situations. And this to me is very interesting. I appreciate that fact because I think in a lot of situations we want to see how it does play out in real life. If we go through Exodus 20, it seems like it's pretty cut and dried, but we're going to actually see that there's going to be some differences, some changes here. Not so much changing the Old Testament law, changing the Ten Commandments, but talking about how does this apply in real life situations. So this is where we're going to be spending some time. And then also, one of the things that we did not discuss last week, but I'm going to discuss tonight, was Alexander Campbell's Sermon on the Law, and try to get into that a little bit. But before we go any further, let's pray. I'm grateful, Father, for this day. I'm grateful for this class. I'm grateful for these students. I'm grateful to you for the fact that they have a profound interest in knowing your word and your will. And I pray, Father, that you bless them and keep them in your care. I pray that this virus has not affected them or their families. I know, Lord, that we're facing a lot of things in a lot of congregations where we have congregations shut down and so forth. And I pray, Father, that thanking you for the technology that allows us to still have Bible classes and still have worship service. I'm grateful, Father, for such a time as this. And I pray that at the same time, while we miss people being with us physically, we pray that we may remember and realize, Lord, how blessed we are to be your people, how blessed we are to enjoy fellowship, to enjoy the hugs, the handshakes, and Father, to maybe remind us of how great we do have it in the church, and to look forward to the time when we can do this again. Father, I pray for every one of my students. You know what they're going through in their lives. You know what their problems are, and I pray that you'd please be with them. Keep us in your loving care, Lord, and help us to honor you, to do what's right. I humbly ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. In Exodus chapter 20, and Jim was mentioning this a few moments ago, and this is kind of where I started the class tonight. Again, he emphasizes the idea in the 19th chapter that God was actually giving them these Ten Commandment laws. I think it's something that we a lot of times assume because of the movies and so forth that Moses got up there and received the Ten Commandment law, and part of it was true. I mean, Moses did go up there and receive part of that law up there, especially again whenever they had broken the law in Exodus 32 through 34. Moses goes back up, makes 2 more tablets of stone, and puts the law on those tablets of stone. And that's where these tablets of stone are going to stay in the Ark of the Covenant inside the tabernacle. So as we started looking at the Ten Commandment laws, we see that they're very blunt, very succinct. But as I mentioned to you earlier, how do they actually work out in real life? Okay, for example, I am the Lord, you shall have no other God before my face in front of me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. And I think later when we start talking about the altars that they had to make and how they had to make them this way, this commandment comes into play in the fact that they need to make sure that they are not going to make an altar that's even going to look like the image of a god. In other words, there's not going to have an altar that's going to be made with cutting stones or so forth like that. He emphasizes the idea that we shall not take the name of the Lord our God in vain. He says that we are to remember, or they were to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. And we're going to talk about how does that work out in real life. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet his wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his oxen, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Now, where we ended last week is right here in verse 18. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. And I've tried to bring this out in the last lesson. I try to bring it out again. in the idea of what it must have been like to hear God's voice actually giving them these commandments. And it scared them so much, the Bible says, that they said to Moses, "You speak with us and we will hear. Let not God speak with us lest we die." And it says something about how they were overawed and overpowered by God's voice. How at the same time that they were sure that, they were doing what God said. And again, they wanted to make sure that they didn't hear his voice. And so Moses said, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you." I challenge us to think about this idea of testing us. And remember the idea, the word test suggests what? What do you do when you take a test?
I guess to see if they retained knowledge that was.
Yeah. You're going to see how much knowledge you have. What else do you do when you take a test?
It's a way of proving. It's a way of determining what you're made out of.
Right. That's very important as we start looking at all of this, and the fact that we know that God, we will find in James chapter 1, for example, also First Peter, the idea that God allows his people to be tested. He allows us to be tested, but he does not give us temptations. God never's going to tempt us to sin, but he will allow us to be tested. And I think it goes back to what one of you said a moment ago. It tests us. The tests are important so that we will see where we stand with God, so that we will understand exactly where we stand with him and see what I need to do in my life to become what I need to be for God. So as we're thinking about this, think about even here, as he emphasizes the idea God has come to test you, it's for the purpose of them seeing where they need to go to be in a relationship with God. It also is to show them their need for God. And so many times I think in our culture and in our country today, we think we can live without God. There's a lot of people that have that attitude. I could make it without God. I don't need a God to worship. I don't need a God to serve. I don't need a God to do this. I don't need a God to do that. And yet, whenever, as an example, where we're going through this situation with the coronavirus right now, what are we thinking? Where's God in all this? Everybody, the folks that don't believe in God, they're the ones asking, where's God in all this? Well, it's always where he has been. And so God is allowing us to be tested. And here's the reason. God has come to test you, that his fear, the word fear there should be better translated his reverence, may be before you so that you may not sin. If I heard the voice of God, if I heard and saw these events take place, would I be as likely to sin? Probably not. But the thing is later, within 40 days of this event, or, right after 40 days, they're going to sin anyway. We are people that really struggle with learning these things. And so we have to go through these tests to see that. So the people stood afar off, but the Lord Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. And again, why do you think there was thick darkness there? Anybody?
Was it a reminder of the darkness in Egypt?
Could possibly be. Anybody else? I think about the idea that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. I think, and here's my way of looking at this particular thing, he gave the thick darkness so that nobody could peer up and see him. If they saw him, then what? They would immediately die. Again, in Exodus 32 through 34, whenever we find that they're trying to whenever they commit that sin with the golden calf, I've lost my train of thought. Please forgive me on that. But anyway, God is light. But again, Moses asked to see the face of God, and God says, no, you can't see my face because you shall die. So I think, again, that was another thing to help them to understand how reverent they needed to be as they did this. So then the Lord said to Moses, you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me. Gods of silver or gods of gold, you shall not make for yourselves. So in other words, you've heard my voice. You have not seen my image. Now remember, Genesis tells us that we are made in the image of God. Did they really understand that at that point in their lives? I don't know. I don't know exactly how much what their learning was and what their understanding of God was all along here. They obviously held on to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they had also gone through 430 years of slavery in Egypt. So exactly what were their views of God? And again, as God has delivered them from Egypt, as he has brought them through the Red Sea, as he has fed them and gave them the water, they're now beginning to know this God in a very personal way. And as we mentioned before, God is being very patient with them as he's going or teaching them more about himself. He says, you shall not make any of these gods. You shall not make. And it's interesting that he repeats this one, because again, later on, that's exactly what they do. Isn't it interesting? It seems like the more we as parents try to tell our children not to do something, then what? They're more likely to do it, right? And could it be that that's part of us as in the nature of being human beings and our relationship with God? We're more likely to do it because he's told us not to? It's something to think about. So again, he's really trying to emphasize to them, you shall not make any other gods. And then along this same idea, and this is what I was referencing a little bit earlier, an altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you and I will bless you. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it with hewn stone, nor if you use tool on it, you have profaned it. And I think what he's doing here is he reiterates the command about not making an image like him or to substitute for him. And he's trying to get them to the point to where, look, whenever you make anything for me, an altar or anything like that, don't even put anything on it. Just make it out of stones that are there. We remember in 1 Kings, the 17th chapter through the 19th chapter, specifically chapter 18, where Elijah builds an altar to God with 12 stones that were lying around. He did not take a tool to it whatsoever. And again, that purpose was he was fulfilling exactly what we read here in Exodus chapter 20 about how that altar was to be built. Look at many of the other altars that you will find through Scripture, and you'll see that same idea. Notice, secondly, as we're looking at this altar, God knew that they were going to have to offer these burnt offerings. So there was going to be a period of time before the tabernacle was totally built, before the altar of burnt offering was built, that they were going to have to offer these burnt offerings to God. Now, we're going to look at that in a lot more detail as we get toward the end of the book of Exodus, when we talk about the building of the tabernacle and how long it took and what all was involved with it. But obviously, as he's trying to emphasize to them what their responsibilities are up front, he's emphasizing, don't take anything that you, again, use a chisel or anything on, make it the way it is. And he says, don't profane it. And whenever you go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness not be exposed upon it. In other words, and again, later on, we're going to see that when they actually make these things, and especially in the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, 9, and 10 and following, whenever the temple is built, we're going to see a lot of stairs going up to the altar where everybody could see what's going on at that place. And in that particular circumstance, he's going to make an emphasis there that the priest, and we'll see this being in the book of Leviticus. We'll see it somewhat in the book of Exodus, but we'll see it again in the book of Leviticus with the idea that that priest, when he's going up the steps to the altar, had to wear the proper undergarments so that he would not expose himself to the people when he did that. So you see, God was trying to prepare them for what they were about to do. God was emphasizing to them, don't be tempted to make an altar or to make an image like in my name according to what you think I look like. And so he then begins to emphasize, here is, in essence, in the latter part of verse 22 or 20, going through 22 through 26, chapter 20, 22 through 26, and the idea, how do you offer these sacrifices to God? And how do you not break these commands with regards to making an image in his likeness? So you see, now we're beginning to see how this actually starts playing out in the real world. So he goes on in chapter 21, the law concerning servants. These are the judgments which you shall set before them. And it's kind of interesting to me as you're looking at this, we remember the first 4 commandments dealt with our relationship with God, and the last 6 dealt with our relationship with our fellow man. And it seems like one of the first things that God does emphasize is how we are to treat our fellow man with regards to them being servants. Now, a lot of people get upset about this in the Old Testament because they talk about the ideal of slavery and they think about how slavery is wrong. And it is. It is. We need to understand that. We need to preach against it and emphasize that it is wrong because it demeans people. Okay? But slavery was a reality of that day, and slavery has and is still a reality today. We talk a lot. It's something that we don't think about on a day-by-day basis, but we talk about in this country about the sexual trafficking that's going on. That's slavery. That's all it is. Pure and simple. It's slavery. Children are being sucked into this, and it should break our hearts. And again, the whole ideal of slavery comes from the idea that some people are under, for lack of a better term, or of less value than other people. God, as he starts laying out the laws regarding how you treat slaves here, and again, this is a commentary, this is a case study of what he means whenever we start trying to treat other people, as he commanded in the 10 Commandments about the ideal of, again, not murdering, not committing adultery, not stealing, not bearing false witness, not coveting your neighbor's wife, all of those things. Here's how it actually plays out if you have servants. All righty? So if you buy a Hebrew servant, now notice this is a Hebrew servant. We're going to see as you go through the rest of the Old Testament that a lot of times servants or slaves would come into play because a nation, another nation was conquered, a city was conquered. Okay? Now, when we actually look in the book of Joshua, whenever they go in and start conquering the land of Canaan, the law was, God had gave a very specific command that all the people were to be destroyed. Why? Because, go back to Genesis 15, the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. So these people had to be punished, and this was God's way of bringing about that punishment. Later in time, we're going to see that the Jews, the Hebrews, would buy slaves of people that were not of Jewish origin. So he says, listen, this is your command when you buy a Hebrew servant. He shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. So you see, he put a limit on how long a man could serve slavery. And as we're thinking about this, we have to think about indentured servants, where a man owed another man money. So what he would do is, in essence, sell himself for a certain period of time to pay off the debt that he owed. Now, what often happens again in those situations is sometimes the owner trying to figure out ways to keep that person a slave forever. And again, that's where all of the issues come in when we start talking about this idea of slavery. So the idea is we're looking at this is he has 7 years to pay off his debt. And so that's what he's doing. He has to work for 7 years. Now, if you read the Code of Hammurabi, which was another code that you can actually read about in secular, the Code of Hammurabi also made this a stipulation. And there's a lot of questions in a lot of people's mind. Did Moses borrow from the Code of Hammurabi or vice versa? I'm thinking, again, there didn't have to be any borrowing. God said this is the way it ought to be. And perhaps he might have taught Hammurabi and some of these others just as he would Moses and these others. So I think we need to take those things into play and understand this when we're trying to figure out what came first. Again, a lot of scholars seem to say that Moses borrowed a lot of this from the Code of Hammurabi. I don't think that he did. You got to remember also that Moses was in Egypt and in a position of authority in Egypt for many years, right? So just think about the idea. He would have known this. He would have known these laws, and this would have made sense to him. But Moses did not set down the law himself. God set down the parameters of the law. And we need to, again, think about that as we're studying this passage. So he says, if a man comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife and has borne him, and she's borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be the master's, and he shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out, then his master shall bring him to the judges. Now you see, God is thinking, we've already seen about the fact how Moses was serving as a judge. So God is thinking about the future when they shall come and, as it was, come before judges to get a definite understanding, and he shall bring him to the door, and they shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Our young people today in our teen classes and so forth sing that song, Pierce My Ear. And it's a beautiful, beautiful song. I submit unto you, there's that same idea going on whenever we become Christians. Think about it. We have become indebted to Christ. He has saved us from our sins. He paid the price for our redemption. So we, as some other songs emphasize, he paid a debt he did not owe. We owed a debt we could not pay. So this idea of piercing his ear emphasized the idea that because this slave saw that he was literally better off living with this man at this particular time, then he would commit himself to serve that man until he died. And that's the beauty of that. So as we're looking at this idea of slavery, we have to understand that a lot of times we look at it with 20th century eyes, 21st century eyes now, and we judge it harshly. And I think a lot of times it's because of the thing that happened in this country, the Civil War, and the events that brought about the Civil War, and what was going on in this country as a result of that. And we think, well, now all slavery that you read about in the Bible was just that way. Let's also be honest about this. Many people during the 1800s, whenever they were trying to justify slavery, went to the Bible to justify it. All right? They did. And the idea is that a lot of times it's like everything else today, and even today, people are going to find what they want to find out of the Bible to try to justify something that they're doing, even though it's wrong, even though if it means mistreating another person. So we can't judge what he's saying here concerning these events by 20th century eyes as we do today. This was something that was very common. And this idea of slavery was not just with the Jews, but it was with every nation at that point in time. Even to the time of Jesus, there were still slaves in the Roman Empire. Many of them, as you read about it in a lot of detail, many of them were even smarter than their masters. You think about Joseph as well in Genesis. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is we're looking at this, we have to be careful not to judge it with 20th century eyes, to try to understand it from their viewpoint and to see what's going on. As God is describing it in this situation, it was a way to pay off the debt. And there was hope that this debt could be paid off and that person could start all over again. Because again, after the 7th year, he emphasizes the idea that the master was to give him something as it was to start, so as for him to start all over again. So in that same respect, we think about this idea of how even in this, there was the dignity of human beings. There was the idea, okay, you've made a debt that you could not pay, so we will let you work it off. And again, emphasize the idea that this is exactly what we needed to be doing. You see, rather than just writing off a debt because it can't be paid, what are we doing? We're actually working the debt off in an effort to pay it off. So again, it emphasized the dignity of the human being. It emphasized how they were to treat one another. Now, later on, again, we're going to see that if you're a slave in this situation, you could be mistreated. You could be beaten. You could lose a tooth. You could lose eyes. But even in those situations, there were provisions that if you hurt a slave's eye or you knocked out one of his teeth, the slave was to be set free. So you see, a lot of times people will go back to the Old Testament to justify these things. They will even go to passages in the New Testament that emphasize things like this to justify it, when it can't be justified that way. But we also, again, got to remember that we have to look at it from their point of view, not our point of view, and how this brought about this. I want you to think about it from another viewpoint as well. Lately, because of the coronavirus, we have been thinking a lot about the idea of how this is going to affect the economy of our country. We have been through recessions before. We have been through hard times. I remember when I was living at home with my dad, he was a structural iron worker, and because money was not tight, they weren't building buildings, he was out work. It was just by God's grace that he was able to find jobs when he needed them. This was in the 70s and the 80s. And since that time, there always seems to be a cycle in economics where you go through a period of prosperity and wealth. And then you always, in every situation, you always hit those times like depressions, recessions, things along that line. And we try our best as humans, right, to avoid that or to lessen the blow of those things. This is how they would handle their economic situations in those times. It's also interesting to me, especially and I'm going a little further afield on this than I meant to, please forgive me. But it's also interesting to me that you look on into Leviticus and Numbers, God will talk about the idea of every 7 years that debts were to be canceled, as in this situation. You will find that every 50th year, the Jubilee year, it seems like, and I'm suggesting what I'm thinking about it is, and I want you to study this for yourself, but it seems like in the year of Jubilee, there was a reset of the whole economy. And here's what I'm thinking. If you owned land and you sold off part of that land in the 50th year, you would, of course, the amount that you would pay for that land or the amount that somebody would give you for that land would all have reference to that 50th year. At the end of the 50th year, everybody would go back to the land that they had to begin with. And you could start all over again. Now, I'm 59. I wouldn't like to think of trying to start all over again at 59. But at the same time, if I did have a reset, if I was able to go back and get my parents' property back and be able to start all over again, that was God's way, I think, of bringing about a reset of the economy over and over and over again. It brought about a situation where it equalized everybody in the situation that they're in, right? In essence, everybody could start as it was from scratch again. The wealthy in a lot of these situations would have made money during that 50 years. They, according to what we read in the Leviticus and some of these other places, they were to help the poor in every way that they possibly could, right? So the reality is, as you start thinking about all of this, I think God used these kind of events to bring about resets in the economy, something that we don't have today unless you want to call them the depressions or the recessions that we wind up going through. Every time you have a downturn in economic situations, you're going to have problems. You're going to have people that's going to be out of work. You're going to have people that's going to need help. And that's when the church has the best opportunities in the world to shine through. I've gotten a little bit of field on this. I'm sorry, I apologize about it, but I challenge you to study these things for yourselves as well and understand where we're coming from. He goes on to verse 7, if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave. Now, as we're looking at this, sometimes what they would do is sell their children. Again, to us, that seems so weird and so out there. But this is what they would do to pay off a debt if necessary. But a lot of times they would do this in an effort to, for the person that owes the money, it would be an effort perhaps to let his children get into the rich man's family, and hopefully, eventually, it would bring about a situation to where it could pull their family up out of whatever situation that they're in as well. So he emphasizes the idea. Notice if he sells his daughter to be a female slave, and if she does not please her master, now I want you to think about the idea. He's still talking about that same girl in verse 7, who has betrothed her to himself. So here's the idea. He sells his daughter, as it was, to pay off debts so that this man may marry her. So here you have that situation where the debt would be repaid. And again, if she does not please her, then he shall let her be redeemed. Now, what does it mean to be bought back? She could be bought back by her parents, okay? But if he's betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of his daughter. So he's saying what? In this situation, you treat her as a daughter. I've got 3 daughters-in-law. I have 3 sons. I've got 3 daughters-in-law. As far as I'm concerned, they're my daughters. Okay? That's the way I treat them. I'm going to treat them with the love that I would if I had daughters. I've got, as mentioned before, I've got 6 granddaughters, 2 grandsons. I love them. So you see, there's that idea of what's happening in this. Here's how you would bring about a situation where, again, people could get out of debt. People would not be in the situation that they're in. All righty? If he takes another, he shall not diminish the first one's food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. Now, this speaks to us a little bit about another problem that we have sometimes in the Bible, and that's the idea of polygamy. We remember that Abraham had 2 wives, right? Hagar as well as Sarah. We also remember, and that's a study in and of itself that could go for 15 weeks, as you look at the families in the book of Genesis, every family in the book of Genesis speaks to family situations today. Whenever you have 2 families in the same household as it was, when you're dealing with stepchildren and all these others, all of the family dynamics that you read about in today's world are found in the book of Genesis. And so that's a great study in and of itself. I actually preached a series of lessons in a meeting at the Valley Church of Christ on this. And I actually did a study at South Cobb on this. So it's a great study. It's an opportunity to do that. The bottom line is he's talking about this. At that time, they had polygamy. We remember that many of them took 2 or 3 or more wives. And we have to scratch our head a little bit. Why did God put up with that in the Old Testament? And I don't have an answer. Okay? We do know from the very beginning of time It was one man for one woman for as long as they both shall live. Genesis, right? So we understand that. So why did God not condemn this? Go back to Genesis 4. That's where Lamech had two wives. Why do we not read God condemning that here? But then when we come to the New Testament, we don't see that polygamy anymore. God really emphasizes in no uncertain terms, it's one man for one woman for as long as they both shall live. So was God just accommodative in the Old Testament? Was he accommodating that situation at that time? Was he turning a blind eye to it? No. By the time we get to the book of Malachi, in Malachi, God will emphasize the idea. He says, he will talk about the fact in Malachi 2:16, God hates divorce. And that's about as clear as you could ever possibly get about how God feels about that particular circumstance. So the thing that I have to understand, and the thing that I have to come to grips with as I'm trying to understand it and grasp it in my own mind, is God did allow it, but did not say that that's what he wanted. When we come to the end of the Old Testament, God is beginning at that point in time to say, no, this cannot continue. When Jesus comes on the earth, what does he say? He talks about marriage and divorce. And let's think about this for just a minute. The way we do marriage and divorce nowadays, because a lot of times we're not following what the Lord emphasized in Matthew 19, we become serial polygamists. You know what I'm trying to say? We have 3 or 4 or 5 wives or 3 or 4 or 5 husbands, but we don't do it all together at once. We just do it in a series. And God really makes clear exactly how he feels about that. And it needs to be taught and emphasized. The other day, I did a wedding service for a couple, and I just happened to see the picture. At the moment in time when I said, till death do you part, in other words, you've got to live with him and you've got to live with her for the rest of your life. You should have seen the look on her face like, what are you talking about? And you see, that's what kind of bothers me, and the fact that a lot of young people today get into this thing saying, well, if this don't work out, what? I can go get me another woman. I can go get me another man. And that's not what God wants. That's not what God desires.
Hey,
I
Tom,
go too far afield here. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
you think about in John 4 when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman,
Mm-hmm.
he tells her, you've had 5 husbands and the man you're with now is not your husband. And
Right.
he obviously did not say, no problem, just, continue on.
Right.
And you think about the adulterous woman in John 8,
Mm-hmm.
he tells her, go and sin no more. He doesn't say, go live your life and have a nice day, So obviously we learned that God never intended for man and woman to be multiples of whatever multiple. So
That's exactly right. He never did. And we've got to get that same idea brought back to the church, to where the church understands that today. Because so often we failed in this matter, and we've got to teach our young people. How are we going to change this? Tommy, the church is filled with people that are this way. How are we changing? You start with young people. You teach them up front, one man for one woman for life, and get this across to them to where they understand that principle, that you just can't quit whenever things get bad, because they're always going to get bad in every marriage, right? So the reality is that's what you got to do. Now, again, I've gone a little bit far afield, but you see how what he's saying here even emphasizes the idea that if you had a polygamous marriage, you were to take care of that woman. Do not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. Study, again, I think I may have mentioned this before, but if I say so much to so many different people, I don't know where I say what to who, okay? Forgive me about this. But sometime back at South Cobb, I did a series of sermons on what it cost divorce, divorce cost in this country. And I looked it up on the internet, and I've been trying to find it since. And if any of you find it, I want to encourage you to do it. But the thing that he found out is that divorce in this country costs, and I'm not just talking about the divorce, but I'm talking about taking care of the children. I'm talking about taking care of all the legal fees. I'm talking about how much it costs the each county every month for food stamps, housing benefits, and all this other stuff. The last thing I read about it was something like $20+ billion per state per year. Now, I'm just challenging you to think about that. So you're looking at literally, if you add to all 50 states, and they're all about $20 billion, think about that for just a few moments. You're looking at a total cost yearly for the whole United States of over $1 trillion a year. That's the cost of divorce. That's the cost of remarriage. That's the cost of all the benefits that we give all these families that are in these bad situations. So, as I said, I don't want to get too far afield on this, but here's that ideal of servants. I know, again, some of us struggle with this, but again, we got to remember the context. Remember, again, the purpose of bringing about that situation where the economy can be reset and how you handle all of this. All righty? Now he actually goes into the law concerning violence. And you remember another one of the Ten Commandments is you shall not commit murder. Now, in the King James Version, it's you shall not kill. In our understanding, as we're thinking about this today, we have to realize that as we think about that for just a moment, there's a lot of difference between killing and murder, okay? Murder is, as we would think about it, and I've, studied a little bit of law, murder is malice. We have different kinds, first, second, and third degree murder, different ones. Then start talking about first and second degree manslaughter. If any of you have ever sat down and watched a few episodes of the first 38 or 48, it emphasizes to me how every state is going to have different laws concerning murder, okay? There's first degree murder where you're doing it with malice aforethought. You're mad, you're angry, you're going to kill this guy no matter what happens, period, end of discussion. And then there's the ideal of, that's first degree. Then you have second degree and maybe third degree. And then you get into the manslaughter where you actually or accidentally kill a man, vehicular homicide. There's a difference between vehicular homicide and just manslaughter. We set up all these different laws, these different standards to emphasize that there are different ways murders and the taking of human life should be looked at. And I think, again, it's one of those things that we could get carried away with, right? As you're looking at it strictly from the viewpoint in the Old Testament, we see here's the simple way to understand this. If you strike a man so that he dies, he shall surely be put to death. That's you shall not murder. But if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. And again, what is that having reference to? That's referencing the cities of refuge that we're going to read about in Numbers chapter 35. So he says, if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Now, this becomes a big issue with a lot of people, especially again in today's world, is the idea, is capital punishment something that we need to be doing today? Years ago, and this was long before I came on the scene, but it really hadn't been that long ago. From the 1920s, 1930s, they would have public hangings. They would not kill a criminal after 2 or 3 or 4 or even 10 years of appeals. if the person was found guilty, they would go through the appeal process. I do know I've read in a lot of situations back in the 1940s, 1950s, they would go through the appeal process and they would probably put them to death within 30 days after being found guilty. But because of there being the situation in our thinking, because some guilt or some innocent people had been found not, or had been put to death wrongly. And again, you're going to have that, right? It's going to happen. People lie about people, and that's interesting a little bit later on as we start talking about the Mosaic Law. If you are testifying against somebody in an effort to have something bad happen to them, and you found out that you are a liar, then what? Under the Old Testament law, what would happen? It would happen to you. So if you lied about somebody killing somebody, yeah, I saw him and I knew he talked to me about it before that he was going to kill me, and they come to find out it was not true, you would be put to death. I tell you what, that would kind of clear everybody's thinking a little bit. But let's talk about the second idea here. Is capital punishment valid? Again, the problem that we have more often today, and I think it's partially because of our judicial system and the attorneys that are making all these laws. The bottom line out of the whole situation is we're looking at all of this. There are a lot of injustices done. There are a lot of situations where, let's also be honest about this. A lot of African Americans are put in prison on a higher rate than white Americans, okay? I think we need to address those issues. I mean, I think we need to be honest about these issues. And we have to ask ourselves the questions, why? What's going on that's causing that situation? Is it because we're not teaching African American descendants exactly what they need to do? Is it because of the lack of teaching? What does it all boils down to? I cannot even begin to talk about all the socioeconomic situations here. I don't know. And I want you to understand, I'm looking at it from the viewpoint of a white man. And so sometimes maybe that needs to be taken into consideration as well. I think we need to, in a society, figure out a way to help our African-American young men to grow up to where they don't have to go to drugs and everything like that, but they live in slums. The teachers that in the public education is not teaching them or helping them to get to the point to where they can find jobs that would pay for their families. And you know, it's what I hate to say it, but it's the honest truth. I think it's becoming the case not just for African Americans, but everybody nowadays. I think the public school system has just gone down the drain. Okay. And I don't think that we're really preparing any of our children nowadays for what they're going to have to face out there in the world. And again, parents have not stepped up to the plate doing what they're supposed to do in this matter. We have gotten away in our society from what God says concerning these things. I think that what we need to understand, and this is kind of a backward way to thinking to some people, but this is exactly what God does. He's emphasizing the idea that the value of a man's life is such that if you take another man's life, you're going to give up your life. Now, that's counterintuitive to us, but it also emphasizes to us that God cherishes life, that nobody has the right to take the life of another man unless they go through due process. And in that situation, if it is determined that that's what needs to happen, then what? That's what needs to happen. Some people argue, well, capital punishment has never really worked. Well, I think it has when it's justly done and swiftly done. I think it does whenever we emphasize, look, it's not that we want to kill this person because of this, but this person has killed that person and he has had no respect for life. So we need to emphasize we all have a respect for life, and we have to, justice demands that we take that life because that person has taken a life. So you see, this is where a lot of people really struggles with this. Now, some lives should not be taken. If he didn't do it intentionally, no. But see, even under the Mosaic economy, what do we have? They had these manslaughter rules. He said if it was done with premeditation to kill him by treachery, you take him so that he may die. And God is emphasizing the sanctity of life by doing that. Well, Tommy, how in the world can God be emphasizing the sanctity of life by commanding capital punishment? And by the way, where does he emphasize the same ideal in the New Testament? What Romans 13 does, right? He emphasizes the idea that this is done, that the government is the avenger of those that do evil. So I think these needs to be done. But here's why we really believe and struggle with this idea. We a lot of times do not think that justice is served.
Hey, Tommy.
Yeah.
When you think about it, this is a principle that God put in place after the flood in Genesis 9. And God is just confirming it and solidifying it specifically for the Israelites here. But this is a principle he's had in place for hundreds of years.
Yeah. And even back, the first murder that was committed in Genesis chapter 4, you ask the question, why didn't he kill Cain? Well, he did curse Cain. But again, there was reasons behind it. They had to get to that level of maturity to where that would have had to happen. So yeah, you go back to the flood, and you see this all the way through the pages of the Bible. I think, again, as I said before, it's gotten to the point in our country, and I'm not trying to be, I hope y'all don't think I'm down on the country. I love our country. I wouldn't trade it with any other country in the world right now. But we've got our problems. We've got problems. And the thing is we've gotten away from God. Therefore, we've got away from thinking the way God thinks. And so now, literally, and I think about this a lot, most of our laws are made by attorneys who make laws so that they'll have a job when they get out of office. I don't mean to be ugly, but let's also be honest about this. Whether we want to admit it or not, if the police or somebody wants to get us on something, they will find something to get us on. Why? Because there's so many laws out there. We read about these old archaic laws that are never taken off the books. We read about all these other things. So you've got to try to keep all these laws. There's no way in the world. There's no way in the world with all the laws that are on the books in the state of Georgia. There's no way in the world with all the laws on the state of books in the county of Cobb. There's no way in the world that I could go out and do anything through the course of a day without breaking a law somewhere. And so you see, we don't deal with this the way we need to. We don't put archaic laws off the books. We find people that try to justify these things. The bottom line is we have no respect for life, abortion, right? And so and it's always been interesting to me that we could take the life of an innocent child, but allow a prisoner to stay in jail for 20 plus years, going through the appeals process, when he has been found guilty of murder on 2 or 3 occasions. There's something wrong with that. In the Old Testament, justice was handled swiftly, justice was handled surely, justice was handled the way that God meant for it to be handled. And they had a higher respect for life as a result of it. I think, again, we've lost that respect. So as a result, the world has divided us, has caused more problems. I could just go on this for hours, but let's just go on and go back here.
Brother Tommy.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a quick comment. One thing that I've always been perplexed about is in our system, we have people, their main job is to argue, regardless if a person is guilty or not, is to win that case.
Yeah.
And, they can be bought, of course, by the highest bidder.
Yeah.
And that's why justice to a lot of people is not justice,
That's exactly
because, yeah, they can be proven guilty, but that lawyer will argue them down to maybe a slap on the wrist.
That's exactly right. And it amazes me. Like I said, sometimes I sit there and I've not watched, well, I've not been in a court case. They usually don't ask preachers to serve in juries. But the bottom line is I sit and look at, like I said, I sometimes watch the first 48, and these people will kill one another over $10 worth of drugs. And then you're sitting there, the evidence was there. They knew what they were doing. They admitted to the fact that these people would admit to the fact that they'd done that. And like you said, sister, they would get the attorney would get it argued down to what? Second degree manslaughter, and they're out within 2 years on parole to do it again. And it just amazes me. And there's just something, and again, it goes back to the idea, and again, I don't mean to be belaboring this point, but let's also be honest, a lot of our laws were made by attorneys to keep themselves in business. And they're always doing things out for that purpose.
Yep.
And that's not what God intended. That doesn't bring about real justice. And as a result of that, it creates even more problems. So as he comes back here to this, with God, it was simple. If a man premeditated to kill, then what? He is to be put to death. End of discussion. There's not going to be a long drawn out appeals process. Nothing like that. He has to what? He has to be put to death. Notice his respect, verse 17. He who curses his mother or father shall surely be put to death. And this could be a situation where he curses his mother and father and asks them to die. So again, it shows the emphasis upon, especially in the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, about our respect for those that are aged. And again, we've lost that in our country, right? We put them in nursing homes and just let them die, and that's not what God intended either. If men contend with each other and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but is confined to bed. So now we're talking about assault, right? They get into a fight with one another. We don't know what the thing is. If he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted, or declared what? Well, he's going to be exempt from punishment. But he's still got to pay. He's got to pay for the loss of his time. That sounds to me like what? Lost wages, right? So if I hit somebody and that assault kept him from work for a week or so, then I'd have to pay him for that week of work. And you see, what would that do? Well, I guarantee you that would make me not want to hit nobody again, right? I can't really afford to pay anybody else for a week of work whenever I'm going to be working. It's hard to do. But there's that justice there. And he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. So he's also paying what? The doctor bills, right? You see, there's justice in that. If I was to have to pay for that in that respect, then that would stop me from being out to look for a fight, right? Sometimes they happen, but let's just understand that. If a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall be punished. Now the question is, what kind of punishment is brought out here? It doesn't really say. It seems to suggest, as we're looking at the whole context of it, that he may be put to death for this, because the whole thing is talking about when do you put somebody to death? And again, it's in that situation. So if he beats his male or female servant with a rod and they die under his hand, he shall be punished. But if he or she remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. So, you can't, I think from what he's saying here, you can't beat one of your servants to death, but who would want to? Think about that for just a minute. If he's working for you and he owes you a debt to begin with, and again, we've got to look at it in that context, where they're not slaves for life unless they chose to be, but slaves that are paying off a debt, then they might, and again, at that time, this is the way some people would be punished. All righty. And again, he is his property. He's going to lose. I mean, if a man is beaten to the point to where he can't work, he's going to lose a few days' work, right, from that person that's serving him. So in a sense, he's still paying for that. But again, we struggle with that, right? We struggle with understanding that. We struggle with really grasping that because we don't do it that way, okay? Now, verse 22 is a very important verse I think we need to look at. And there's a lot of different ideas and comments on this. If men fight, all righty, they're struggling, and hurt a woman with child, so she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm comes. Now, the word "she gives birth prematurely" in the New King James in the Hebrew says, "and her children come out. Yet no harm follows. He shall surely be punished according as the woman's husband imposes on him. He shall pay as the judges determine." So now it's not what that man seems to think is right. Let's be honest about that. If somebody hurts me, and I'm upset about it, I'm going to want a lot more out of them than maybe what is just. And we're talking a lot about justice here, right? Justice is doing what's right. So suppose I got into a fight and a guy broke my nose and done some other stuff, and that person had to pay. I would be the wrong person to ask about how much should they pay you for your broken nose. How much has he got? That ain't enough. You know what I'm trying to say? Now I'm trying to get vengeance. I want us, as we're looking at this, also to key in on this idea. Look at the idea here that vengeance is what God determines. We will find throughout Scripture we need to let God handle vengeance, right? And that's where, again, we struggle a lot because nobody's going to spit on me. Nobody's going to hurt me. I'm going to get them back. And then the thing escalates, and that's the reason why people wind up being killed. Now, the thing here is, then he goes on in verse 23 and says, if any harm follows, you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So, this a lot of times has been misunderstood. And that's the reason why I wanted to get it back in its context. When God was emphasizing the idea of eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, even Mahatma Gandhi says, well, if everybody walked around taking out another person's eye for an eye or something like that, we'd be having a lot of blind people. But the thing that he's emphasizing here, there's a limit on how far you can go. The idea in this passage is this: if you hurt my foot, I can't take your life. All I would have to do would have to have something that would be equal to you're hurting my foot. Or if you stuck something in my eye, and again, there would be a lot, again, it might have been accidental or something like that. Again, what would you do? You wouldn't want to take the life of the person who maybe accidentally or maybe in person or on purpose. You would not want to take that person's life. You would what? There has to be justice here. You can't go beyond what's been done. So, in the context of this passage emphasizes the idea, when he's talking here about verse 22 and 23 about a woman who gives birth prematurely, this passage has been used a lot of times to talk about abortion. If two women or if two men are in a fight and one of them gets and causes the child to be born dead, then in that situation, that man should be put to death. And that does seem to be what this passage seems to suggest. But if there is no harm, in other words, the baby comes and the baby's fine, whatever happened to cause that baby to be born at that moment in time, obviously because of the fight, then you were not to demand that other person be killed, but what? You would ask that person to pay damages according to what the woman's husband imposes on him. And again, we got to remember at that time, the final word in the family was the husband's word. Okay, that's the way it would have to go. All righty. So again, you have this idea. This is the way it was. But now we come to Jesus. Jesus teaches us what? Whenever your enemy is hungry, you feed him. If he slaps you on one cheek, turn to him what? The other also. Man, that's kind of tough. So now, as we're looking at all of this, man, this thing is really emphasizing to us exactly how God felt about it. So here it is. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. If he knocks out a tooth for his male and female servant. And interestingly enough, this chapter starts off with what? Talking about the idea of how servants should be treated. He says, if you knock out a tooth, if you take out an eye, then what? You got to free your slave. You got to free your servant. And you see, there was that provision along that line. He emphasizes not only the laws concerning violence. Now, you remember back in Exodus 20, you shall not commit murder. Well, now he's given us some of those situations. There are situations where manslaughter takes place, where there's not premeditation, where an accident happens. He even talks about what you do with a woman that has a child, right? Well, what about animals? How do you handle animals? Now you're talking about, again, you're dealing with a situation concerning property, all righty? If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. But, and again, I want you to think about this for a minute. Romans 12, verse 19, let's read that passage. Larry was bringing this idea out earlier. Romans 12, verse 19. He says, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will recompense, says the Lord. And that passage is found beginning in Deuteronomy chapter 32 at verse 35. So if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. Thank you for looking for that up for us, Larry. I appreciate that. Okay. So getting back to the idea of the ox. If he gores a man or woman to death, the ox is to be killed. And I want you to think about this from this viewpoint. That would be a loss to the person that owned the ox. It would be kind of like if you had a tractor accident, you would stop using the tractor. Okay, that's kind of the way it is. And again, you wouldn't do that because you relied upon it. But if the ox tended to thrust, in other words, this cow was inclined to do this with its horn in times past, and his owner knew about it, and he has not kept this ox confined. So if it kills a man or a woman, then what? His owner shall be put to death. That speaks a little bit about animal control laws, right? So think about, again, our animal control laws. If we have those dogs that are maybe have been trained to kill, and one kills somebody, that's it. There's been dogs that do that. Again, we remember Michael Vick many years ago and what he did with training the dogs to fight one another and kill one another along that line. Again, the bottom line is he should be put to death. We are responsible for the animals. God is even emphasizing that. And I again emphasize that idea because sometimes we fail to take that into consideration today. I think about, again, dogs and cats and people not taking care of them and so forth. As I said, I was raised on a farm. We had cattle. I was never gored by an ox. I was butted by a bull. I have a lot of respect for cows now. You know what I'm saying? This was the bull in that situation. But I have respect for animals. I try to take care of them. We had dogs, and my dogs were treated like family. But when both of them passed, we just decided that's it. I didn't want to go through that again. So we haven't gotten another dog, though sometimes we have. We are responsible for animals. You see, again, as you look through these laws, nowhere do you see where somebody's trying to blame or put the blame on somebody else. We all have to bear the responsibility that we have for what we've done or failed to do. And so even here, he emphasizes these things. He says, put to death, if there's imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life whatever is imposed on him. The owner shall be put to death, but then suppose, let's go back to the law that he gave earlier. Suppose an ox gores a man and he lives for 3 or 4 or 5 days. Of course, that would be a very hard way to go. Then you would what? It would be a different situation than the man immediately dying. You would maybe force the man to pay money because of his upkeep while the man was in that situation. If the ox gores a male or female servant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver. Now, I want to keep looking at this idea of the servants and how much the servants cost, 30 shekels of silver. We remember that the Lord was sold for what? 30 shekels of silver. That was the price of a slave. So, and the ox shall be stoned to death. A man opens a pit. A man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or donkey falls in it, then the owner of the pit shall make that ox or donkey good. They shall give money to their owner, but the dead animal shall be his. So again, those things happen, and again, whoever is responsible has to pay. If one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox they shall divide. You see the justice there? I see justice there. If it was known that the ox tended to thrust in times past and his owner had not kept it confined, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. Again, having worked with cattle, we did have, like I said, we did have a bull one time that, and I understood what's going on. The bull had a case of pink eye. He lost sight in his eyes. All righty. And what wound up happening as a result is he was still the bull that we needed to service the cows. We couldn't afford to get another bull at that particular time, but he would often get angry because he couldn't see. I remember when we were trying to drive from one pasture to another, I would have to kind of walk by his side. And whenever he wasn't going the way he needed to, I'd kind of slap him in the side a little bit. He got mad on a few occasions, was trying to, of course, he couldn't see. So that was my advantage. I could get out of his way before he could, before he'd come charging down on me. But the bottom line is I can't even begin to describe to you how massive these animals are and the damage they can do to somebody. I mean, they can kill you in a heartbeat. So this is exactly those laws. Now, as you go on for chapter 22, he starts talking about the responsibility of property. So suppose somebody steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it and sells it. Then he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If I knew up front that it was going to cost me 5 times what I paid or whatever I stole from the animal, I'm not going to steal, right? And again, think about this whole idea with regards to, again, back to our justice system. We put a man in jail for robbery. Yes, well, we should. There needs to be punishment. But there's never, it seems like a lot of times, there's never any restitution demanded. If it does, he's supposed to do it in prison somehow or another. We take him out of prison. And has he learned his lesson? I don't know. But now we put so many restrictions on him, he can't find a job anywhere. So what have we done in our justice system? We've now made it just about impossible for the man to what? Get a job, to be able to better himself, right? And so you see, these are problems that we haven't really addressed. So again, here's how you did it. The man kept the man wasn't thrown in prison because he stole this ox, but he had to restore 5-fold. So they let him keep working. What? They let him keep working so he could pay the other guy back. There's something to be said about that. There's justice in that. So he had to not only try to, and you see that necessarily meant he would have had to work that much harder, because why? Well, now I've got to work to take care of my family, but I've also got to work to pay off this debt. If a thief is found breaking in and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. Now, this talks about a man who breaks into a house at night. And here is one of those passages that emphasize the ideal of self-defense. So if a thief is found breaking in and he's struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for the bloodshed. If the sun has risen on him, he says, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. He shall make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he has to be sold for his theft. Now, the idea is if the man breaks in the middle of the night, we don't know what the man is doing. We may think that the man is going to harm us. So in that situation, we defend ourselves and take his life. He may have just been planning on stealing something, but we don't know that because we don't know what he's coming to the house to do. If, however, he does the same thing in the middle of the day, we see him coming in, we see what he's trying to do, then what? If he steals it anyway, okay, so I'm driving up, I've gone to Kroger, and I come up and I find a man getting out of my house with my TV. I'd first say, thank you, I need a new one anyway, but you know what I'm trying to say? But the bottom line is, no, you say, no, you put that TV back, you're going to make restitution. You're going to do what you're supposed to do. You got to remember, think about this in this respect. We don't really read anywhere in Scripture where they had police forces. If somebody had a problem, they took the person to court. They dealt with it right then and there. And that was it. There was no police force to force this thing happening. You don't read here at this particular time when these laws are given, we don't read that the children of Israel were an army ready to fight off, defend themselves, right? They had just gotten out of Egyptian bondage. So the thing is do some of these laws only apply while they're still on this travel? What exactly is going on here? How long is this going to last along that line? So that's the next questions that we have to think about and consider as we're looking at this in that respect. Obviously, he's talking about some things that's going to happen when they actually get into the land and how the Ten Commandment law brings out. One of the things that I haven't emphasized enough, but I hope that I have, is the fact that we need to treat one another. We need to treat men with the due respect that God gives for every man. If a man works hard and gains property, then I don't have the right to go and stake that property. If, again, you got to remember this was mainly an agrarian society. So when we're talking about oxen and all, we're talking not only about animals they would eat, but also what? The ones that they needed to put their crops in. So you see, this would make a difference in where a person, if they would have enough food for the year. This is how these things come into play here. So he goes on, if a theft is found alive in his hand, an ox or a donkey or sheep, he shall restore double. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed and let loose his animal, and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. Again, the difference of the world now and the world then, we had a bull, and I share a lot of my stories here, but we had a bull that continually got out of our fence. Every time we'd fix it, and this bull was a huge, massive bull, and he would get out. He would break through the fence. And I'd be patching fences all the time. My dad and I was. One time he got out and we called the guy who owned the property next to ours and asked for permission to get on his property, get our bull back. He wouldn't let us have it. He wouldn't let us have permission to get on his property to get our bull back. So Dad was really aggravated about that, you know, trying to round him up and all that other stuff. And it just so happened about that time that a bull decided to come walking back about the way he got out. So my dad cut the fence, drove him back into our property, and fixed it back up. But you see, here's one of those guys. Here's one of those things. Every time I read this, I think of these stories. I'm telling you, I've got a lot of them. But the bottom line is that if that cow got in there and grazed on that pasture land, then he was to give the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. If fire breaks out and catches thorns, so that there's stacked grain or standing grain as the field is consumed, he who kindled the fire shall make restitution. In other words, you got to pay the price. If you deliver your neighbor's money, or if a guy delivers you something to take care of, and it's stolen out of the man's house, if the thief is found, he shall pay double. But if the thief is not found, then the master of the house shall be brought to the judges to see whether he's put his hand into his neighbor's goods. Well, you gave it to me for what? Well, you gave it to me to watch, but hey, I used it for myself. And you see, there will be a trial for that. For any kind of trespass, ox, donkey, sheep, clothing, you know, that's kind of blows our mind a little bit. Who would steal articles of clothing? Well, again, you got to remember that a lot of those folks literally lived not like us with closets full of clothes, but they would live with what? 2 or 3 changes of clothes, and that was it. So these things had to be looked at and considered in all respect. He says, they shall both, the parties shall come before the judges. Whoever the judges condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. If a man delivers to his neighbor a donkey, an ox, or sheep, or any animal, and it dies as herd is driven away, no one seeing it, then an oath of the Lord shall be put between them both, that he has not put his hand into his neighbor's good, and the owner of it shall accept that, and he shall not make it good. Now, you start looking at this idea of the oath of the Lord. There's where we come in with the idea of, you know, we ask somebody to witness and say, so help me God. There's that idea that we have here. This was an Old Testament idea. But I think at the same time, there was some way, and I can't really explain how, but there was some way that they're getting God involved in the judgment. Again, what would happen today if we got God involved in judgment? Of course, we know God is going to always do what's right. He's always going to know who is right in every situation. Did God, sometimes did they ask God's help to make sure that they're getting the right person? Did they ask God's help? Were there lots cast? There's a lot of discussion here as to exactly how, or what the oath of the Lord would involve, and whether or not it would be God getting involved in these situations to show who was guilty and who was not. Looking at it from our point of view now, we can only speculate about what it could be. But making that oath to the Lord also suggests the idea that whenever you make a promise to the Lord, what? You had to keep that promise. So if I was brought up on charges and I'd say, so help me God, it's not just a saying, but I think at that particular time, it was a literal situation where God's name was invoked and God would have shown who was guilty and who was not in that particular circumstance. So I think as you're looking at all of this, there may be more to this than what we just actually read here. Again, we don't really see how these things can be brought out much more than that. All righty. Again, if the animal stolen from him, he shall make restitution. If it's torn in pieces by a beast, they shall bring it as evidence. He who shall not make good what is torn, if a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it becomes injured or dies, the owner of it not being with it, he shall make it good. You know, and my daddy always taught me, again, growing up on a farm, if you borrow something from somebody, you return it back to them better than you got it. And I never have forgotten that. And so a lot of times, you know, I might borrow a truck, or used to borrow before I had my own truck. Now I have to borrow my own truck, by the way. But one of my kids have got it. But the bottom line is if somebody let me borrow a car or something like that, and they gave it to me with a quarter of a tank, I guarantee you, whenever it pulled back up in their driveway, it had a full tank of gas. And depending on how long, I might have even changed the oil for them. You know what I'm trying to say? So that's something to emphasize. Do better than what you got. So that's the idea here. If the owner's with it, he shall not make it good. All right. I want to take about a 5-minute break. I've been going at this now for about an hour and a half. So let's take about a 5-minute break. We'll come back and get on through the last hour. Okay. Thank you, guys. And going back to Exodus, we are now dealing with the moral principles, ceremonial principles. If a man entices a virgin who's not betrothed and lies with her, then...
Stop the recording?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Okay.
Then he says, he shall pay the bride price for her to be his wife. And if her father refuses, he shall pay money according to the bride price of the virgins. So again, the way they would do marriages at that particular time is the parents of the people that were getting married. This would be a marriage that the parents would choose. They would choose who the child would marry. And it's not like our situation today where we just go down through there and try to pick and choose by dating and so forth like that. And they would actually pay bride money, prices for that. They would pay for this. And I think, again, that's where a lot of these ideas that women, you know, the husbands or the fathers of the bride paying for their weddings and so forth still are there. All righty. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. All right. Well, that's pretty succinct, and you don't have to get there with a whole lot. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. All righty. He who sacrifices to any god except to the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. You shall not mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So, you know, the idea of aliens, and we even saw this in another passage, and we'll see this as we continue to look through the book, and that's the idea that there was going to be one law for the ones who dwelled in the land as well as those who were living or just staying in the land for just a short period of time. We've already seen that, so again, we're going to see it here. You shall not mistreat them. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. God is looking out for the widows and the orphans, okay? And we need to be looking at that. And he said, if they cry to me, I will hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot. Now, I want you to think about it. As Moses is telling them these laws, and they have seen how God had delivered them from Egypt because God's anger was directed toward Egypt. What do you think that would be going through their mind whenever they said, my wrath will become hot and I'll kill you with a sword? Your wives will be widows and your children fatherless. So isn't it interesting? Notice the justice there. If you're not taking care of the widow and fatherless, I'm going to make you, I'm going to make your wife a widow and your children fatherless. You have to take care of them. Again, God is emphasizing the responsibilities we have to one another as human beings. All righty. Then he said, if you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a money lender. You shall not charge him interest. Wow. Isn't that interesting? They were not allowed to charge interest. All righty. So, and he said, you will not take your neighbor's garment as a pledge. You shall not, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that's his only covering. This is the garment for his skin. What house shall he sleep in? And when he said, when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your sons you shall give me. Remember the test question. One of the test questions on the midterm was what? In lieu of the firstborn of all the children of Israel, what tribe did God choose? The tribe of Levi, that's right. And so That's what I was looking for in that question. You shall do so with your ox and sheep. In other words, when you have an animal and the sheep, and this is their firstborn, you have to give that to God. On the 7 days, on the 8th day, you shall give it to me. You shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by the beast in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. Okay. Wow. So you see, this is again going back to how the 10 Commandments are actually working out in real life situations. Chapter 23 continues to talk about this. You shall not circulate a false report. You do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. In other words, you don't lie in court. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. You shall not, nor shall you testify in dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. And again, he will emphasize the idea, you shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. You've got to do what's right, even if it may cost the poor man. Okay? Now, a lot of times today, that's, going back to what Sister Walker said a few moments ago, or excuse me, Sister Pittman, the idea is, again, justice. I struggle with our justice system again because we talk about suppressed evidence. We talk about inadmissible evidence. If the police officer does not get the evidence the proper way, if there were not proper search warrants and things along that line, and we do that to protect the evildoer in a sense, or to be to the point to where we've got to make sure all of our I's are dot and the T's are crossed. Don't get me wrong. But sometimes, true or false, in our country, we have used these things against justice, right? That police officer didn't notify me of my rights. By the way, most of us have probably grow up hearing the Miranda rights that are always quoted. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say shall be used against you in a court of law. You have the rights to presence of an attorney. Does anybody know right off the top of the head when that was required to be quoted? Anybody?
If I remember right, it was mid to late 60s.
Yeah, seriously. I was listening to and again, this dates me a little bit because I listen to a lot of old time radio shows, and I was listening to an old time Dragnet show. This was back in the late 40s, early 50s. They never, ever, ever, ever quoted anybody their Miranda rights. Never. They never did. And what's interesting about that is that I think it may have been, like you said, about 67, 68. I even watched an old Columbo movie. And Columbo had to pull out the card and read it. And it just so happened, I think it may have been one of the earlier ones that was not required. But whenever it was required, he had to pull out the card to read it. So it's interesting how life has changed and how we are trying, or we do our dead level best to emphasize to folks that they have their rights. But sometimes I think at this time, and don't get me wrong, and I don't want anybody to misunderstand what I'm saying, sometimes we make so many rules about what can and cannot be used in court as admissible and inadmissible evidence that, again, people that have committed crimes have gotten off scot-free because, going back to what Sister Pittman said, what? They paid the attorney enough to get them off on that technicality. They were guilty any other way, but they were paid off, or they paid the attorney to get them off on that technicality, and that was that.
Or it's not about truth, it's about winning the case.
That's exactly right, and that leads us back to what we were saying before. So it really emphasizes to me, as you're looking at it from a biblical viewpoint, their main concern should be and would be justice. As we look at it from our viewpoint, it still should be justice, right? Not who has the money to pay the guy to get me off. It should be what's right. So he says, You shall not charge interest. You shall not take a garment as pledge. He says, you shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce, the firstborn of your sons. You shall be holy men to me. And then that's where I was getting back in chapter 23. He said, don't put your hand to the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Justice has to be served. I submit unto you that God is going to get justice right when he finally does decide to bring about justice on the earth. He's going to get it 100% right. And that's what's going to surprise folks. There will be no attorney that you can appeal to at that moment in time to try to get you off on a technicality. And so you see, the challenge is that we need to help people to understand that God is going to be a just God. We preach a lot about his love, his mercy, and his grace, as well we should. We must emphasize his justice as well. All right. He says, if your enemies, you shall not show partiality, a poor man in his dispute. If your enemy's ox or his donkey goes astray, bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you will refrain from helping it, help him. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. So earlier he says, you shall not show partiality to a poor man. Now he's saying, you shall not pervert the justice of the poor in his dispute. So don't lie. Remember, you shall not bear false witness. Keep yourself from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and righteous. I will not justify the wicked. How many men have been killed because somebody lied about them? Just honestly think these things through. When we look at the whole morass of sin and see how bad it is everywhere, and we see the injustice that's being done, God's people need to be a people of justice. And that's what we need to be doing. He said, you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the land. Now, the word strangers here comes from a Hebrew word which suggests the idea of sojourners. So again, that's it. Now, notice some other laws that he gives here. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. What we do in our country today to help the land to produce is we use a lot of chemical fertilizers. They did not have that at that day. How did they fertilize the fields back in those days? From the cattle and the sheep and all that other stuff and their waste. Okay. So what they would do is every 7 years, they were told that they were not supposed to plow or anything else. They were supposed to let the land rest. And God brought it about, probably nourishing the soil with the nutrients that it needed to take care of the crops that were necessary in that situation. And he says, let the beast of the field eat it. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days you shall work. On the 7th day you shall rest, your ox, your donkey, and the son of your female servant, and the stranger may be refreshed. Be circumspect, and make sure no mention is the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your mouth. Now, as we started this whole study in chapter 20, he kind of keyed back in on that idea of that, what? You shall not make any other God before me. So now he's coming to the end of this, and he says, you shall not take the name, or you shall not mention the name of other gods. Don't even let it be heard. Then he starts talking about the 3 annual feasts. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which followed up on the Passover. Remember that? So a lot of times you find this Feast of Unleavened Bread sometimes called Passover throughout Scripture. And he says, you shall eat it 7 days in the month of Abib, in the Feast of Harvest, the first fruit of your labors, and the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year. The Feast of Harvest and the Feast of Ingathering. And he said, all your males shall appear before the Lord God during these 3 feasts. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with unleavened bread. So again, when they're offering their sacrifices, they had to make sure it's right. Why? Again, leaven was associated with the ideal of sin. The first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a mother's or a young goat in its mother's milk. Some people say, well, Tommy, why did they give that command? I'm positively not sure. It's unless it's the idea that the respect for the animal's life and eating the animals. That's the only thing I could come up with as I've read through some various passages that suggest that. Looking at Brother Roper's command here, or what his comments are here, he mentions the 3 feasts, and then he mentions this idea. Let me just quote to you what he says. If you're looking at, again, this commentary by Coy Roper, what is required is clear. Why it was required is more difficult. One is that some people think it would be cruel to cook a young goat in its mother's milk. The most common explanation is because this was a feature of a pagan Canaanite religion. So we don't really know why, but it seemed to have been something that would have been associated with the idea. They would boil a kid in the milk and a lamb in the butter. So that was associated with some pagan festival, pagan god somewhere down the line. So that's the best we can explain on that one. Then he says, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. Now, I talked with you before about the ideal of the angel. And again, notice that his name is in him. That gives us another little clue right there, doesn't it? If this angel of the Lord is Jesus Christ before he was incarnate as a human, then notice his name is in him. If you indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, I will be an enemy to your enemies. My angel shall go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works. You shall completely, utterly overthrow them, break down their sacred pillars. So you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water. I will take sickness away from the midst of you. I was reading this passage, getting ready for this tonight, and thinking about the idea that, this was a promise he made to them specifically, that he would take their sickness away. I will not allow miscarriage or be barren in the land. I will send my fear before you. What we've read, what I'm getting to eventually is this. He makes this commandment. He makes the 10 commandments. Now he's shown some examples. By no means examples, or by no means laws to fit every situation, because the purpose of law is to give you general outlines, not to find every specific situation. When you read court cases, they a lot of times will take the judgments and put them together a little bit later on. And if you're an attorney, you have to learn how to look up court cases to fit the particular circumstances that you're dealing with at that moment in time. And you will see how other courts, how other judges have interpreted the law to fit that specific situation. So in this situation, that's exactly what God was doing. He's saying, I've given you the 10 commandments. Here's what you do. Here's how it works out in real life. Now, we're about to make and to bring about this confirmation of the covenant. So he's getting them ready. And he makes some promises to them. He says, you shall not suffer miscarriage. I'll send my fear before you. He said, I will send hornets before you, which you shall drive out all these people. I will not drive them out in 1 year, but I'm going to do it little by little. I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the Philistia, to the desert, to the river. The river would be the river Euphrates. You shall make no covenant with them, nor shall you make their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, nor shall you make you sin against me. He says, it shall surely be a snare to you. Now, chapter 24. Here is where they affirm the covenant. You remember back in Genesis 15, when God made the covenant with Abraham, they had a feast, they ate together. Here in Exodus chapter 24, God is eating with the representatives of Israel. So he says to Moses, you come up to the Lord, you, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. And who are Nadab and Abihu? Huh?
The sons that are going to die for offering of unauthorized fire.
In Leviticus.
Aaron's sons.
That's right. They're sons of Aaron. That's right. And 70 of the elders of Israel and worship from afar. So you come up and you worship from afar. Now, later we're going to actually see that he chooses 70 of the elders of Israel. Is this the same 70? We can only guess, speculate. But he says, they shall worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near the Lord. They shall not come near, nor shall the people go up with him. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice, and they said, what? All the words which the Lord has said, we will do. So Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. He rose up early in the morning, built an altar. And you remember earlier, the first thing he mentioned was about how they were to build the altar. And he made 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the God. And he took half of the blood, put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled in the altar. So they offered these burnt offerings and peace offerings. And he took the blood and sprinkled it on the altar, put it in the basins. And he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord said, we will do, and we will be obedient. Then he sprinkled the blood on the people. When the Lord, and he says, this is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. Now, you remember week, or I think it was last week sometime, where we emphasized the idea of the Passover lamb, and Jesus is our Passover, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. Isn't it interesting that whenever they affirm this covenant here in Exodus, blood had to be shed? Right before Jesus shed his blood on the cross, what did he do? This is my blood of the covenant. So you see a reenactment of the history of Exodus with the new covenant and the blood of Christ. And we partake of that blood in that very same way. So, or not having it sprinkled on us as much as we're what? We're drinking of the fruit of the vine. We're eating of the unleavened bread to remind us of a covenant that we made with God whenever we became Christians, and God made with all mankind. So it's interesting to me, you see the parallels between the Passover, and now as they're beginning to enter into this covenant relationship with God, and they now begin to start hearing all that is said, again, they have blood sprinkled on them. So they're on the mountain with God, verse 9. Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. Now again, did they actually see God in the flesh? Well, we remember in Exodus, he's going to tell Moses later, you can't see my face. So the question is, how did they see God? Was this Jesus? Was it like Revelation 4? Was it like Isaiah 6? We're not certain. We're not certain. But somehow or another, these saw God's feet. And now, mainly, again, maybe what they're seeing here is just his feet. The nobles on the children of Israel, he did not lay his hands, so they drank God, or they saw God, and they ate and drank. And the Lord said, come to me, and I will give you tablets of stone, and the law and the commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. Notice here, God gives him the 10 Commandment law. And again, you shall teach them this. Well, Moses in Exodus is going to break all of them. And I mentioned this joke before. I'll say it again. You know, he's the only guy that broke all 10 at one time. But the bottom line is he broke this. And later, when he goes back up on the mountain, what's going to happen? He's going to have to write it this time. This one actually was written by the hand of God. So he went into the mountain. The glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And he called to Moses out of the midst of the mountain. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire in the eyes of the children of Israel. So he went into the midst of the mountain and went up to the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. I wanted to get through chapter 24 tonight because I wanted to bring out the covenant and the idea of what's going on with the covenant here. Last week, I also talked briefly about the idea of going over this Sermon on the Law by Alexander Campbell. And I think that I wanted to go through that because what we're reading in Exodus chapter 24 was the making of the Mosaic covenant with the children of Israel that they were to be abiding by. One of the biggest problems or the biggest discussions in the church today, in not only in the Lord's church, but also in denominations, is the fact of where does or how does the Bible divide itself? In other words, are Christians under the old covenant law? Now, most of us would sit back and say, no, there's no way in the world that could be. But I ask you to read this particular sermon on the law because he makes some very good points here. To get the background of what's happening in Alexander Campbell, he got into a discussion with the Regular Baptist Association on his sermon on the law. And what he was doing was answering he had preached a sermon. If you read the letter or the sermon, he emphasizes the idea. He said it was kind of an impromptu sermon. I didn't have that much time to prepare for it, but here it is. And he then gives them and tells them these points. Number one, if you're looking about on page 5 of this, he says, I want to point out what the law is in Scripture. Secondly, I want to point out what the law could not accomplish. Number 3, and according what law is he talking about here? He's talking about the Mosaic law. He said, I want to demonstrate the reason why the law failed to accomplish these objects. Even Paul will often talk about the idea that the law could not bring us to salvation, right? And so that's the reason why Jesus had to give us a new law, a covenant law. He said, I want to illustrate how God remedied those relative defects of the law. And in the last place, I want to deduce such conclusion from these premises as must be necessary. So he goes on and he starts talking about how the law he's talking about here, the law is, during the time of Moses, the word the law was never used, but we talk about the Mosaic law. Joshua talks about the book of the law, all righty? So when we find the law, he emphasizes the idea in the New Testament, it's called the law of Moses, the royal law, the law of liberty, versus the law of Christ, the law of the Spirit of life. But you have none of that said about the Mosaic law. I really want you to look at page, if you're looking again at this sermon on the law, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4 on page 5. In modern times, the law of Moses is divided and classified under 3 heads, denominated the moral law, the ceremonial law, and the judicial law. Now, to get a little bit more background on this particular circumstance, you need to go back and study the Westminster Confession of Faith, as well as the Baptist Confession of Faith that he was addressing at that time. And that particular document mentions the idea of the moral and the ceremonial and the judicial law. Campbell makes the point, validly, I think, Campbell makes the point that there is no such discrimination in the Mosaic law or even the law of Christ. We hear people today emphasize the idea that some people say, well, the moral law is still in effect, but the ceremonial law is not. So the ideal is offering the animals. That's not in effect anymore. But the moral law that God set up on Mount Sinai is. Well, you could also make the same argument that he gave the law to Adam and Eve. He gave the law to Noah after the flood, Noah and the Noahic covenant and so forth. So the bottom line is you still do not read in any Bible passage where he breaks them down into these three sections and how this brings that out. So his point, and he's dealing with, and I want you to understand that as he's dealing with this particular sermon, in that particular time, in that particular subject, they would all understand what he was talking about when he uses the moral ceremonial, because they had this document that broke that old law down that way. So I wish, again, I had the opportunity to go back and read all of that document to you, but I'm just trying to emphasize to you the idea that he's trying to bring out here. We can't make distinctions in those three things when we look at the law of Moses or any other law that God has given, because you don't see that. We do see, however, that Jesus will talk away about the idea of doing away or fulfilling the law of Moses. He fulfilled it. He did not abolish it, but he fulfilled it. He said, do not think that I've come to destroy the law. I did not come to destroy it, but to fulfill it. When he fulfilled the law, then what? There was no need for the law anymore. So this is the main reason why I wanted to bring out the idea, and he says it better than I ever could in that respect. And the bottom line is, the point that he does make is that no person, and this is the point that Paul makes in Galatians, the 3rd chapter, verse 23, and other passages, no person could be made perfect by keeping the Old Testament law. This law, Galatians chapter 3, was a schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ. It was a tutor to bring us unto Christ. And it's upon this principle that we really need to help people inside the church as well as outside to understand once again, because I think we've lost this. He talked about the idea that whenever we became, when this country became the United States, a lot of the laws that were found under British rule found their way into constitutional law, right? But you see, we could not say that we were still under British law if we were now a whole totally different country with a whole different set of laws.
Brother Tommy?
Okay.
Just a couple of things. The distinction between moral, ceremonial, and civil. Some people also make another distinction in terms of the health laws.
Mm-hmm.
So they break it down into 4. But for me, it's interesting when in the book of Nehemiah 9, when the 10 Commandment the giving of that 10 Commandment law is being reminded, they were reminded of it, from verse 13 through to 15, where all of the covenant, the statutes, the ordinances, the law constitute the law. And Jesus talks about what is the greatest commandment in the law, suggesting that it was not divisible as we would want to make it.
Right. And I think it's important for us to realize that, we have to look at, and this is the point Campbell makes, the Old Testament law was given to what group of people? Only the children of Israel. That's it. You have to be a physical descendant of Abraham, unless you chose to become an Israelite and be circumcised, then they would allow you to be part of it. But again, it would be only given to that particular group of people. Now, again, we go back to the Old Testament to try to justify a lot of things that we should not thought about this or to try to justify things that we don't, or to try to justify things in the New Covenant that we shouldn't. A lot of people will go back to the Old Testament to justify the use of instrumental music and some other things like this. And this is the reason why we strive not to do that. He also emphasized the idea, and I never thought about this, but as I was going through this, one of the things that he mentions that on the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus was there with Moses and Elijah, Moses and Elijah, one of them was the lawgiver, the other was the law restorer. And what do? They resigned their honors at the feet of the Messiah in the presence of James and John. We don't know exactly what they did there. We and I think maybe he might be adding something in there in that respect, but it's something I never thought of that before. I don't know if you had ever thought about that before either or not, but I wanted you to think about that as well. And the point that Campbell is making in all of this is that we were never under that law. Is the law of Moses a rule of life for Christians? And again, some people say, well, not all of it. Okay, then what part of it is under law? If I take one part of it and make it under law, then I need to be bound by every bit of it. That means I need to kill the animals. I need to circumcise that. I need to worship on the Sabbath day. Well, they sit back and say, well, are they rule of life to Christians? They said, well, yeah, the 10 Commandments are binding upon us today. Then we need to worship God on the Sabbath day, right? That would be Saturday, not Sundays. So you see, these things that we really need, and that's part of the reason why I wanted you to read this for yourself and come to grips with this with yourself. Brother Rex did mention last week that he wanted to ask something about that. Do you have anything about that now, brother? Do what?
Yeah, yes, I do.
Okay.
I'm these pages aren't numbered, but
Yeah, I know.
okay, the fourth page from the back.
The fourth page from the back?
Yeah, it's easier that way. Not as many pages to count. Up at the top, it actually starts on the page before. It's talking about the law of Moses, a rule of life to Christians. And then on the next page, it says, so that reading the precepts and Moses' words of hearing him utter them does not oblige us to observe them. It is only what Christ says we must observe. So is that telling us that we shouldn't believe anything in the Old Testament?
No. He's saying that there's a difference between, I think what he's emphasizing here, and I'm trying to find the exact quote you're trying to find. I don't see it right off the top of my head, but the bottom line is we know that Romans 15:4 says that whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning. So we do learn things from the Old Testament. We learned that they could not keep that Old Testament law. We learned that God, and Paul will talk about this a lot in Galatians chapter 3, God was trying to show the world that we could not be good enough on our own by keeping the law perfectly. Nobody could keep the law perfectly. We could not be good enough on our own to make it to heaven, because the first time that one person sinned by breaking the law, then the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 4. So that could never take away sin. The purpose of the law, from what he emphasized, the Mosaic law, okay? The purpose of the Mosaic law was to show what sin was and to show our need for a Savior. So when we start talking about the idea of looking in the Old Testament, and this is where this bothers me a little bit too, and I understand where you're coming from. Some people say, well, we shouldn't even study the Old Testament because it has nothing for us. Yes, it does. Number one, it teaches us what it would require for us to make it to God without a Savior. And the problem is with that, Paul was saying in Romans 3, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We couldn't do it. No person upon this planet, with the exception of Jesus, has ever kept the law perfectly. Jesus did it to be the perfect sacrifice for all of us. And in that respect, when he died upon the cross, he lived that perfect life. He therefore did not abolish the law, but he fulfilled the law, and he at the same time did away with the Mosaic covenant. He set up his own covenant, the New Testament, the covenant of Christ. And that's what we're living under today. And that's what he's emphasizing to us. He emphasized, again, Larry brought out the idea in Romans 8, verse 3, what the law was weak in that it could not save man. So the Old Testament is written for our learning. It teaches us that we cannot be saved by our own law keeping and doing it in and of and by ourselves. It showed us the need for a Savior, and it tells us that much more about Jesus. Read Isaiah 53, read Genesis 3, and see that seed promise all the way beginning in Genesis 3, going all through the rest of the Old Testament, finally finding its fulfillment in Jesus in the New Testament. So, yes, we need to study it. I think that we in the church are abysmally ignorant of the Old Testament, and I think we need to do a much better job of it, because it is the very Word of God. But can we be saved by keeping that Old Testament law perfectly? Absolutely not. That's why it took Jesus. That's why the Old Testament is telling us about Jesus. And again, Paul will say, study that, because we learn from their examples. And over again throughout Paul's writings, he'll go back to the Old Testament time and time again to point out things that they did not learn or that they did not get, but we have the opportunity to do now.
Brother Tidwell?
Yes?
I think another mistake that we make in the church is to think that the Old Testament system was so bad that there's nothing that we can learn from it. So we usually pitch when it says the New Testament is better, we automatically believe that the Old Testament was not good. But the fact is, it was good for what it was designed to be, for what it meant to do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just that the New Testament is better, and that there are a lot of things we learn, and we should be learning and studying from the Old Testament to make us better understand who God is.
That's exactly right. We cannot know all about God without going through the Old Testament and seeing how he reacted to his people as well as others all the way through there. So I don't agree with the idea that we don't need to study it. I think we need to study it a whole lot more to get a better understanding of God, so that we would appreciate God's grace, God's love, and God's mercy in Jesus Christ more and more and more. And I personally, I get kind of annoyed whenever, and I even told some brethren that, they say, well, that's just the Old Testament. We don't study that anymore. We don't need that anymore. Yeah, and that's part of the reason why we're going down the same road as the children of Israel are, because we're not learning any more than they did under that situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am absolutely not, even though the Old Testament has been done away, it is there for us to learn. And it's important that we do spend the time. And I commend all of you for taking these classes. You'd be surprised how many folks want to go through the New Testament. And we have a lot of folks signing up for New Testament classes. But you would be surprised at how many folks do not want to take the Old Testament classes. And that says something sad about on our behalf. I want you to go home and think about this as well. When was the last time, wherever you're attending church, when was the last time any of you studied the Old Testament in a Bible class situation? Chew on that one for a few minutes.
We just finished the book of Genesis not long ago because I taught it. We're actually going through the book of Exodus right now on Sunday morning. So fortunately, we are doing it. So yeah.
Good for you.
Warner Robbins, we just last week completed a series of lessons on Isaiah and looking at how Isaiah gave us glimpses of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we have studied Isaiah. We just finished studying Isaiah.
Yeah. In fact, back last year, somebody asked me to do a study on Revelation. And I said, I'm not going to do that till we study the Old Testament prophets. And I ran through them. And I'm talking about I ran through them. But it still took 6 months. I started with Isaiah and just literally just tried to run through every one of them. It took 6 months. And I still felt like that we were running so fast we didn't see all that we could learn from it. But before I wanted to study the book of Revelation, I wanted to get that background from the Old Testament, because the book of Revelation cannot be really understood without understanding the Old Testament prophets. So,
Hey, Tom. Hey,
okay.
Tommy. Hey, Tommy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, we was talking about the Old Testament law. I'm reminded of what Paul said, and I just went and looked the word up because I couldn't remember exactly how it was worded. But you think about what Paul wrote to Colossae, chapter 2, verse 14, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that is against us, which was contrary to us. That word contrary, if you look it up in Strong's, it actually means the adversary.
Yeah.
So the Old Testament law was actually, even though it teaches us a lot of things, it was our adversary because we could not keep it perfectly. We had no chance. And so those who say, well, you know, what's the purpose of this and what's the purpose of that? If we don't understand what the purpose was, then we'll never get the point of what Paul's trying to say, you know, to Rome or to Colossae, or like you said, to Galatians, or you know, any of the other New Testament books. If we don't understand what the idea was behind the Old Testament law and what it was to do for the Israelites, then we don't understand what the New Testament law is going to do for the church. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, brother, I hope that helped. I hope that helped answer your question. As I said, I'm not for, I'm not for just having New Testaments and studying that all the time. We need to study it all the time. But we do need to understand this distinction that God and Jesus himself made in passages such as Colossians 2, Ephesians 2, the book of Hebrews. The entire book of Hebrews deals with it. Matthew, whenever Jesus said, I did not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. And when he fulfilled it, then it was not needed anymore. We need to learn from their lessons. Any other questions or comments? I hope I answered all those questions. And next week, God willing, we will pick up with chapter 25.
Hey, Brother Tidwell.
Okay.
That paper on Alexander Campbell, did you send that to us?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay, I got to check my emails and see.
I sent it to you back. It may have been on the syllabus on how you can click it.
Okay.
And if not, I think I resent it to everybody one other time. So that document is there. If you don't do nothing else, brother, you can look it up on Google. Type in Alexander Campbell.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander
Sermon on the Law.
Campbell, Sermon on the Law.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
All righty. Thank you so very, very much. Appreciate all of you do that.
All right, brother. Thank you so much. You have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
Have a good
You
week.
too.
Take care now. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
All right.